Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. Eleanor Whitford arrived in the village of Redwick on a gloomy autumn afternoon. She drove her old car along narrow roads flanked by pine forests and empty fields. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, whispering a silence far deeper than the absence of sound. After years in noisy London, Eleanor had finally chosen solitude. Her recent divorce, coupled with the miscarriage of her first child, had left her emotionally hollow. So when a letter from a solicitor arrived, informing her that she had inherited an old estate from a distant relative she barely remembered, she didn't hesitate. The house stood alone at the edge of the village, wrapped in rusted iron gates and overgrown gardens devoured by time. The structure was grand but weary. Its slanted roof and cracked red brick walls bore the scars of age. Two tall front windows stared blankly onto the narrow road, like watchful eyes awaiting someone's return. Eleanor stepped out of her car, the keys trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from the biting cold. Yet in her chest stirred a strange sensation. Not quite déjà vu, but more like the house had been waiting for her far longer than she had known of its existence. The next morning, Eleanor was awoken by the soft clinking of a tea tray outside. From her bedroom window, she saw an elderly woman standing by the gate, dressed in a wool cardigan and long skirt, holding a small tray. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Gainsbury, the only neighbor within several hundred meters. She lived in a small cottage nestled behind a curtain of trees, almost hidden from view. Her face was kind, but her gaze lingered too long on the house, betraying something more, concern, maybe fear. Mrs. Gainsbury explained that the house, known as Redwick House, was one of the oldest buildings in the village. It had once belonged to a wealthy family who vanished mysteriously. Since then, the property had remained untouched, never sold, never rented, merely maintained by the town's caretaker. The villagers kept their distance. Some said the house was cursed. Others believed it was alive. But no one offered a clear reason. When the woman left, Eleanor noticed something odd. Only a single set of footprints marked the damp earth, coming and going in the same place, despite the fact that Mrs. Gainsbury had taken a different path when leaving. Perhaps it was just a trick of the eye. But that night, Eleanor couldn't forget the woman's final glance. It wasn't mere politeness. It looked more like a silent warning. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed the windows and wind scraped against the old glass panes like fingernails. Eleanor had only unpacked a few essentials, her bed, some clothes, and a few books. Around midnight, she was jolted awake by a sound. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, like heavy boots dragging across old floorboards. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. This wasn't a dripping tap or swaying tree branch. These were steps. Above her. In the attic. Except there was no attic. During the day, she had examined the house thoroughly. The slanted roof left no space for an upper room. There were no visible ladders, no crawlspaces. Still, the footsteps continued, measured, heavy, and human. With a flashlight in hand, she checked the ceilings and corners of every room. Nothing. But when she returned to bed, the sound resumed. Louder. Closer. Until it paused directly above her bed. She didn't sleep again that night. Instead, she sat upright, eyes wide, blanket clutched tight, listening as the footsteps came and went at random intervals. Sometimes they stopped for hours. Sometimes they returned after just minutes. Always above her. Always watching. 2 days later, while organizing her study, Eleanor moved an old bookshelf left by the previous owner. As she shifted it, one of the wooden floorboards creaked and loosened, revealing a small hollow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in a piece of brittle cloth, was a leather-bound journal, dusty and worn. On the first page was a name, Edward Mullen, 1946. The pages were filled with neat handwriting at first, but as the entries progressed, the writing grew increasingly erratic and frantic. Edward described strange occurrences in the house, sounds in the night, walls that seemed to breathe, and the chilling sense of always being watched. Most disturbing was a phrase repeated dozens of times on the final page, "This house will not let me leave." The words were scratched in so forcefully that the pen had pierced through several pages. At the bottom of the page was a dark, crusted stain, too old to identify, but Eleanor's stomach twisted at the thought. She shut the journal and placed it on the desk. But that night, when she returned to the study, she found it open again. To the same page. As if someone, or something, had been reading along with her. Later that week, Eleanor hired a young man from the village, Thomas Elridge, to help clean the overgrown backyard. He was quiet, reserved, and worked with peculiar caution, almost like he feared the ground he walked on. Eleanor mentioned the basement, which she had yet to open due to a rusted lock. When she did, Thomas stiffened. His face drained of color, and he quickly averted his eyes. He said nothing for a while, then muttered something cryptic under his breath, "There are things that shouldn't be awakened." She watched him from the window one afternoon and saw him standing before the basement door, whispering to himself while gripping a small wooden pendant around his neck. There was a fear in his posture, not of something outside, but of something inside. That night, Eleanor dreamed of doors creaking open by themselves, and of voices speaking in forgotten tongues. And when she woke, the house felt heavier. As if something deep below its foundation had heard its name spoken for the first time in years. Eleanor had delayed opening the basement. The lock was ancient, rusted, and stubborn, as though the house itself resisted her effort to descend. When she finally forced it open with a crowbar borrowed from the village tool shed, a gust of air rushed out, cold and foul, like something exhaled after being trapped for decades. She stood at the top of the narrow steps for a moment. The light from her flashlight barely pierced the bottom. Every part of her instinct screamed against going down, but curiosity held firmer than fear. The walls below were stone and sweating. Dust coated the wooden beams, and cobwebs drooped like funeral veils. Shelves lined the far wall, filled with jars of preserved herbs, books in languages she couldn't identify, and crude wooden carvings of faces twisted in anguish. At the center of the basement stood a circle of chalk, faded but still visible, and black candle stubs at each point. Eleanor didn't step into the circle. She didn't need to. She felt its pulse in her chest, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. As she turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut above her. The bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered violently. In that moment, she wasn't alone. A cold presence pressed behind her shoulder, unseen but undeniable. When she escaped the basement, she didn't remember climbing the stairs. She only remembered the overwhelming sensation of being watched by something that had just woken up. That night, the smell returned, not musty like mildew, but sour and metallic, like rotting blood soaked into wood. It drifted from room to room, always just ahead of Eleanor, as if luring her. She chased it from the hall to the kitchen, through the living room and back up the stairs, until she found herself in front of the attic trapdoor, except there was no attic. But now, there was a hatch. It hadn't been there before. It sat above the hallway ceiling, square and wooden, with a metal ring for pulling. Eleanor stared at it for a long time. When she fetched a ladder and opened the hatch, the stench grew stronger, almost unbearable. A ladder unfolded down slowly, creaking with unnatural rhythm. The attic was pitch dark. Her flashlight revealed dust and broken floorboards, but also something else, deep claw marks along the beams. Not from tools or animals, but as if something had tried to escape. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were the same words from Edward Mullen's journal. "This house will not let me leave." But below it, in fresh red ink, was something new, "It remembers you." Over the next few days, Eleanor tried to keep herself occupied. She painted, she wrote, she rearranged furniture, anything to keep her mind from spiraling. One afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs hallway, she noticed an old painting she hadn't seen before. It was a family portrait, early 1900s, judging by the clothes. A man, a woman, and a child stood before Redwick House. Their faces were stern, their eyes too sharp. The painting gave her chills, but she didn't remember ever hanging it. It hadn't been there a day ago. Later that night, as she passed the hallway again, she stopped cold. The child in the painting had moved. Where once he had been standing beside the mother, now he stood several steps ahead, facing away from the viewer. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But each time she passed the portrait, the boy shifted further down the painted path. Walking, always walking toward the woods in the background. When he finally disappeared from the painting entirely, she heard footsteps outside her window. That night, she locked her door for the first time. And still, something scratched lightly at the floorboards just beyond. Eleanor's sleep became restless. Every night she was awoken by whispers, soft, fragmented voices that seeped through the floor like water through cracks. They weren't in any language she recognized. They were layered, as if many mouths whispered in unison, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. One evening, while lying frozen in bed, she felt her mattress lift slightly. It was as if something enormous had shifted beneath the floorboards directly under her bed. Not a tremor, but a push. She stared at the ceiling, too afraid to look. The air turned icy, and her breath misted above her face. The whispers swelled, pressing into her skull, until they ceased, abruptly. In the silence that followed, something knocked once from beneath her bed. Not like a house creak, not like a rat scurrying. It was deliberate. A knock, as though something waited for acknowledgement. The next morning, a section of floor beneath her bed had splintered outward, from the inside. On the fifth night after unlocking the basement, Eleanor stood before the large antique mirror in the hallway. Her reflection stared back, pale and tired, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. But then, something shifted. She blinked. Her reflection did not. It continued to gaze, expression unchanged. Then, slowly, it smiled. Behind her in the reflection, a figure stood. Tall, thin, with hollow eyes and a face too long to be human. It didn't move like a person. Its presence was oily, thick, like it poured itself into the shape of a man but had never been one. When she turned in panic, the hallway was empty. But the mirror still showed the figure, now closer. She grabbed a cloth to cover it, but the glass cracked beneath her touch, spiderwebbing outward with a sharp hiss. Across the broken surface, a message had been carved as if from within, "Welcome home, Eleanor." She stumbled back, breath ragged. She now knew this wasn't just an old house with a haunted past. Something had claimed it. Something had remembered her. Something had been waiting. And now, it was awake. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to find dirt beneath her fingernails. She hadn't gone outside. The bed was smeared with soil. At first, she thought she had sleepwalked, perhaps wandered into the garden in some strange fugue state, but then she noticed the trail. It wasn't leading out. It was leading in. She followed the trail back to the basement, against every instinct. A soft, muffled humming echoed faintly as she descended. The light bulb above buzzed and flickered. In the far corner of the room, the stone wall appeared, different. Damp, darker than before. Her fingers brushed against the mortar, and she realized it was softer than stone should be. She pried at the seams until a brick gave way, then another. Behind it was a narrow hollow. A hidden room. She squeezed through, coughing on the stale air. The chamber was barely larger than a closet. In the center stood a child-sized bed, rotting and warped, and along the walls, names had been scratched, dozens of them. All written in the same frantic hand. Some were fully crossed out. Others, half erased. At the bottom of the wall, in bright red, was the newest one, Eleanor Thorne. Among the forgotten items on the basement shelf, Eleanor had seen a thick, dust-covered book bound in black leather. She hadn't dared touch it. But now, compelled by a force she couldn't resist, she retrieved it and brought it upstairs. The moment she opened it, the room fell unnaturally silent. No wind, no creaking, not even the faint tick of the grandfather clock. The pages weren't filled with text but with symbols, some mathematical, others occult, and many simply indescribable. On the last page, written in English, were the words, "To remember is to awaken. To awaken is to invite." The air grew heavier with each passing second as she stared at the page. Then, a whisper spilled from the book, raspy and feminine, repeating a name not her own. She closed the book, but the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, crawling into her ears, nesting behind her eyes. She threw the book into the fireplace, hoping to destroy it. But the fire refused to touch it. Instead, the flames darkened, turned blue, then black, and hissed violently before extinguishing themselves entirely. The book remained untouched on the ash. Night had fallen, though Eleanor couldn't tell anymore what time meant inside the house. Shadows no longer behaved as they should. She saw them stretch, linger, and move when they shouldn't. From the corner of her eye, they formed shapes, tall, lean, twisted, resembling a man with elongated limbs. Then, one evening, as she approached the upstairs bathroom, she saw a figure at the end of the hallway. At first, she thought it was her reflection again, until it moved toward her, soundless, smooth, not walking but gliding just above the ground. She locked herself inside the bathroom, heart hammering. The doorknob turned slowly, deliberately, from the other side. No knocking, no pounding. Just turning, over and over again. Eventually, it stopped. But when she opened the door an hour later, something had been carved into the wood from the inside. It was a date. October 31st, 1922. The night Edward Mullen vanished. And beneath it, one word, remember. Eleanor turned to the village for help, finally breaking her silence. She asked around, hoping to uncover forgotten history. Most shrugged, avoided her gaze, or claimed to know nothing. But an old man at the edge of town, who hadn't spoken a word in years, pressed a small envelope into her hand when she passed. Inside was a photograph, black and white, heavily faded. It showed Redwick House, years ago. In every window, a figure stood watching. Faces blurry, eyes stark. Not just one or two people, dozens. Too many for a home that size. And in the front, barely visible, was a little boy with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't belong on any child. On the back, written in tight script, the house was never empty. It only waits. Eleanor realized the truth, Redwick didn't contain a haunting. Redwick was the haunting. The structure, the walls, the air inside, it lived, fed, remembered. And it never let go. That night, the house sighed. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. Eleanor heard it breathe. The floor groaned with relief. The walls contracted as if inhaling. The lights dimmed and flickered with every exhale. She sat in her studio, unable to sleep, staring at the blank canvas she had prepared days ago. Her fingers moved on their own. She painted. Not with her own intention, but with something else's direction. By the time she stopped, the canvas was filled with red and black smears forming a twisted silhouette. It was the man in the mirror. And behind him, in the painting, stood herself. When dawn arrived, the house was still. The shadows returned to their places. The whispers quieted. The mirror unbroken. But Eleanor Thorne was nowhere to be found. All that remained was the painting. Her signature at the bottom. Fresh. And the faint sound of breathing, deep within the walls. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.